Hey friends, so in this video I want to talk about the Gospel of John, chapter 9, verses 1 to 41, which is the Gospel reading for the fourth Sunday in Lent in year A of the lectionary. And I want to do something a little bit different in this video, in the sense that, again, like the last video on John 4, this is a really long story and I can't possibly fit all the text onto the screen. But in addition to that, I think because of some of the sort of background that goes into this story, it's not even necessarily helpful for me to walk through the story step by step as I did in the story with John 4, because I kind of want to jump around to different things. So if you have not already read John 9, I would recommend that you just pause this video here and do that before we get started, because I'm not going to be reading through the text. So, with that said, I'll just quickly say that the story begins with Jesus healing a man who was born blind. He spits on the ground and makes mud and puts the mud on the man's eyes, and then tells him to go wash up in the pool of Siloam. And when he comes back, he's able to see. And so other people who know him encounter him, and they're amazed by this, and they even argue about, whether it's the same guy or just somebody like him. And so anyway, so then they bring him to some of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees start to ask him all these questions about how he was healed and what happened, and then also the Jews, which I'm going to talk about that language here in just a second, come and start to ask him all these questions. And so I actually want to jump kind of into the middle of the story here with what I have in this orange box from verses 20 to 23. And hopefully the reason that I want to jump into the middle of the story will become apparent, because these verses are not only critical for understanding this particular story, but I think most scholars would argue that they're actually critical for understanding the Gospel of John as a whole. That in fact, many commentators sort of read the historical let's say reconstruct the historical context of the Gospel of John through these. I mean, not through these verses alone, but these verses are essential in doing so. And so I want to start there. And so what's happening here is that, again, he's had the Jews have come and have dialogued with this man who was born blind and who can now see, and they're asking him all these questions, basically interrogating him, saying like, how could this possibly have happened that you were healed? And so they even then go to his parents, and they sort of ask his parents for verification and say, is this your son? Was he really born blind? And so that's what we pick up here in verse 20, is his parents answered to the Jews. Again, I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Jews in air quotes, I would want to say at this point. But his parents answered, we know he is our son. We know he was born blind. So they confirm the two questions that they've been asked. But they go on to say, but we don't know how he now sees, and we don't know who healed his eyes. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. And then we have this sort of explanatory comment by John. His parents said this because they feared the Jewish authorities. And in fact, the CEB here translates it as Jewish authorities. Again, it actually just says the Jews, hoi iudaioi, in Greek. This is because the Jewish authorities had already decided that whoever confessed Jesus to be the Christ, and here is really the critical thing I want to focus on, would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why his parents said, he's old enough, ask him. So in other words, in this story, they come to the parents and ask all these questions, and the parents are like, yeah, he's our son, and we know he was born blind, but we don't have anything to say about how he was healed. And the reason that John gives for that is because they know that anybody who confessed Jesus to be the Christ would be expelled from the synagogue, and they don't want that to happen. So they sort of answer out of fear, saying, he's old enough, ask him. Okay, so I start there because I want to use that as a lens for thinking about this whole story and the context of John's gospel as a whole. And so I want to talk about this language of the Pharisees and the Jews in John's gospel, and in this passage in particular. Like I said, it's first the people bring the man to the Pharisees, and then it's later, quote unquote, the Jews who are sort of interrogating him and his parents. Now, in terms of the Pharisees, it makes sense historically that Jesus would debate with the Pharisees about the meaning of the law, right? And we see this in all four of the Gospels, not just the Gospel of John, that Jesus is constantly debating with the Pharisees. And in fact, in many sort of Christian readings of the Gospels, the Pharisees are sort of always the bad guys, right? Because they're the ones who are always arguing with Jesus. And so, of course, we're going to take the side of Jesus. He's the hero of the story. He's the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, right? So clearly Jesus can't be wrong, and so that almost by default makes the Pharisees wrong, right? Because they're always arguing with him. But like much recent scholarship on the Gospels would actually point out that perhaps the reason Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees so frequently is actually because he agrees with them about a lot of things. It, in other words, the Pharisees and Jesus both agree that the law is important and that doing God's will is important and that the law is an important witness to that. They disagree about their interpretation of the law. They disagree about exactly how to fulfill God's will in following the law. What does it mean to follow the law, to follow the spirit of the law, right? And so I often liken this to Jesus doesn't fight with the Pharisees because he's so radically different from them. He fights with them because they actually have so much in common. They fight because they're siblings, right? This is the way siblings fight. That siblings can quibble over the smallest thing, and in some ways, it's actually because they have so much in common, right? So that's one way I think we can think about Jesus's arguments with the Pharisees. And in addition to that, the fact that you know it's a normal thing for Jewish folks to argue about the meaning of the law, right? So Jesus's arguments with the Pharisees doesn't mean that they're like demonic or something, right? Um, this is what you do. You debate about the meaning of the law. I mean, when you read the later rabbinic literature from a couple centuries later, which I think most scholars would say like that rabbinic movement comes out of the movement of the Pharisees. What you see is the rabbis arguing about the meaning of the law. This is what rabbis do, right? And so there is a sense in which Jesus's argument with the Pharisees are just very rabbinical, right? This is what you do. You argue about the meaning of the law. It doesn't mean that the person you're arguing with is a horrible person, right? This is part of what it means to be a faithful Jew, is to argue about the meaning of the law, right? So there's a certain sense in which historically Jesus's arguments with the Pharisees make perfect sense, right? There's sort of nothing surprising there. But except that we should note that again, we don't have to make the Pharisees the bad guys all the time, right? Or just because they are arguing with Jesus. I think there's this different lens through which we can see those arguments. But the Gospel of John does something that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not do. Even though Jesus argues with the Pharisees in all four Gospels, it's pretty unique to the Gospel of John, distinctive to the Gospel of John, that Jesus' opponents are also often labeled as the Jews. And you don't have to think about that for very long to recognize that, like, historically, that's at least puzzling, if not downright doesn't make any sense at all, right? It's puzzling because, of course, Jesus is Jewish, right? And Jesus' disciples are Jewish. In fact, in most instances in the Gospels, everybody who's on the scene is Jewish, right? That everybody who is in conversation is Jewish. And so there is one sense in which it is very puzzling to call Jesus's opponents the Jews when that title should apply to Jesus himself and his disciples and virtually everyone else who is a part of these conversations. So when we see John's gospel calling Jesus' opponents the Jews, we have to kind of ask ourselves, well, what is it that's going on here? And why does John use that language? And many scholars would point to this passage of scripture in John that I've highlighted in this orange box right here, that what's going on is that when John uses the language of the Jews for Jesus' opponents, that this doesn't so much reflect how things were in the lifetime of Jesus as it does the time period in which John the gospel writer himself is writing. In other words, that this concern in this story about people who confess Jesus to be the Christ being expelled from the synagogue, that's probably not a real life thing happening during Jesus's lifetime, right? Because the Jesus movement is sort of so small and so just beginning that at that early stage in Jesus's actual life, people are probably not being expelled from the synagogue uh, because they're interested in the Jesus movement, right? But by the time that John is writing his gospel, let's say near the end of the first century or the beginning of the second century, many scholars think that maybe this does start to represent the what is happening, at least in some places, right? Maybe not everywhere and maybe not in every synagogue, but at least in the Johannine community itself, whoever John is, the community that John's writing this gospel for, that perhaps they have been expelled from the synagogue because of their confession of Jesus, or that they're afraid that they might be, that there's some growing tension between this Johannine Jesus following community and the synagogue that presumably they had previously been a part of, right? That probably many in this audience are Jewish and perhaps still think of themselves as Jewish, even though there is now this tension with the synagogue of which they've been a part, or perhaps from which they've been expelled. Now, I do want to note that this reading of John's Gospel is not without question. There are some scholars who have pushed back on it. I believe, if I remember correctly, Richard Bauckham would be one of them. So I do think this is still kind of the mainline interpretation of John's Gospel. But I'd encourage you, if this is something that you're interested in or that you're questioning, that you just look into it yourself, right? That you could look at the commentaries on John. I think Raymond Brown, J. Lewis Martin, John Ashton are some scholars who have articulated some variation of this view. And so I would encourage you to look into that for yourself. But I'm generally persuaded by it for the most part, and so that's the approach that I continue to take to John's gospel, is that the reason uh, Jesus's opponents in the Gospel of John are often the Jews is because this is reflecting what is going on when John is writing his gospel. It's not so much representing what was happening in Jesus' lifetime as it is representing what was happening with the Johannine community when he's writing his gospel. And so this is, in many ways, sort of runs through this story, this conflict between Jesus and quote unquote the Jews. And I think having that context of the tension between the Johannine community and the synagogue that they are part of or had been a part of is really informative as we continue to think about this story. So, for example, if we pick up in verse 24, I've got this over here in this green box. Therefore, they called a second time. The Jews called a second time for the man who had been born blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner." The man answered, "I don't know whether he's a sinner. Here's what I do know. I was blind and now I see." They question him, "What did he do to you?" And remember, they've already asked him this once, so now they're asking him, "What did he do to you? How did he heal your eyes?" And I love this reply from the man who had been born blind. He replied, "I already told you and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Right? I don't know if we should read this as a sweetly eager and naive question of "Oh, you guys must be interested in becoming his disciples too," or if it's a sort of I don't know, kind of snarky type question of "Oh, do you guys want to become his disciples?" In any case, the quote unquote Jews here, again, the man himself is presumably Jewish. Jesus, everybody's Jewish, but the ones that the Gospel of John labels the Jews are insulted by this. They're like, "No, you're his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses, uh, but we don't know where this man is from." And the man answered, "This is incredible. You don't know where he's from, yet he healed my eyes." this exchange here that I've put in the black bold text at the bottom, I think really, I think this takes on new meaning when we think of it in terms of this tension between the Johannine community and and the synagogue, right? In some ways, you can almost imagine that the this exchange between the quote unquote Jews and the man born blind is in some ways actually representative of what you might imagine as an exchange between the Johannine community following Jesus and the leaders of the synagogue, right? That the leaders of the synagogue would be saying, yeah, you all are disciples of Jesus. We're disciples of Moses, right? That's where true discipleship lies. We're supposed to be following the law. We're supposed to be following Moses. Don't, don't insult us by suggesting that we be disciples of Jesus. We're following Moses, the one we're really supposed to follow, right? And then this line that they say, we know that God spoke to Moses, but we don't know where this man is from. That is such a loaded sentence in the context of John's gospel, because the whole thing that John, one of the biggest thing John wants you to know about Jesus is where he's from, right? If you remember back to the video on John 3 and the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus, in some ways this is what the conversation is all about, is where are you from, right? Because uh, John says to Jesus says to Nicodemus, "You must be born in Nothan." And Nicodemus says, "How can I be enter my mother's womb and be born a second time?" And Jesus then emphasizes, "No, no, no. You have to be born from above. You have to be born from spirit, right? Because remember, we talked about Jesus is the man from above. He's the one who descends from heaven with the heavenly wisdom. So this statement that the quote unquote Jews make in verse 28, we don't know where this man is from. It's like, yeah, the Johannine community, they're going, yeah, exactly. That's the problem. You don't know where this man is from. We've been trying to tell you he's the one from heaven. He's the one who brings heavenly wisdom, right? And so the man born blind, his answer is really representative of the Johannine community. This is incredible that you don't know where he's from, yet he healed my eyes, right? So there's so much to unpack there, because you can really imagine the Johannine community saying, yeah, okay, you all are disciples of Moses, you follow the law, and that's great, but Jesus has healed our eyes, right? So it's sort of like what the Johannine community is saying through the man born blind is, we were blind but now we see, which is exactly what the man born blind said up here in verse 25, right? Here's what I do know: I was blind and now I see. And I think that's what the Johannine community is saying we were blind, right? But Jesus has given us sight. Jesus has healed our eyes so that now we see he is the man from heaven. So it's just sort of fascinating when you read the story through the what we presume is the historical tension, that the man born blind, that this isn't just a story about healing, as remarkable as the story is in and of itself, right? Even if it was just a story about healing, it's a remarkable story. But it takes on, as we've talked about in the Gospel of John, these conversations are always happening at two different levels, right? And this story takes on this whole new meaning when you can see the man born blind as essentially the Johannine community saying, we were born blind, we didn't see, but Jesus gave us sight, and now that sight includes that we can see that Jesus is the man from heaven, but now you all don't see that, right? You are former, you know, compatriots, our fellow synagogue members, who knows, maybe family members, right? You don't see that Jesus is the man from heaven because you're still looking at Moses' teaching in the same way, and we're trying to tell you Jesus has given us sight to see Moses' teaching in a new way, so that we actually see that Jesus is really the fulfillment of Moses' teaching, right? He is the one who brings the true wisdom down from heaven. And the way the story concludes, I've put over here in this light blue box, the way the story concludes really drives this point home, right? Jesus said, I have come into the world to exercise judgment. Oh, I should fill in some of the story here. So the man born blind does get expelled from the synagogue, and Jesus hears about that and goes to him and has this conversation with him and says, do you believe in the Messiah, right? And the man born blind says, yes. Who is he that I might believe in? Or he says, do you believe in the human one? And he says, who is he, sir? I want to believe him. And Jesus said, you have seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. And the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped Jesus. So again, the man born blind is a kind of stand-in, a representative of the Johannine community, right? Because he recognizes Jesus as Lord and worships him, right? All right, so after they have that conversation, then Jesus says to the man born blind, I have come into the world to exercise judgment so that those who don't see can see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard what he said and asked, surely we aren't blind, are we? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you wouldn't have any sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains. This to me is a fascinating conclusion to this story, and in some ways gives it a real, I think, practical application to our own spiritual lives. That Jesus, I think, is saying here, John is saying through Jesus, that your sin isn't that you don't see, it's that you think you see. And that's actually what causes you to be blind, right? He says if you were blind, you wouldn't have any sin, right? Because again, this man was born blind, and remember, the story starts actually with the disciples asking Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus from the start says, no, it's not about that. It's not that he sinned or his parents sinned. It's that so the works of God might be manifested or revealed in him, right? And so it's not a sin to be blind in this story, right? Like, just because the Johannine community was initially blind, that doesn't make them sinful, right? But because they were blind, Jesus has given them sight. Jesus saying this, the sin here, your sin remains because you say we see. And I think that's actually a critically important point in a lot of ways for thinking about this passage, especially because of the way the quote unquote Jews are painted as, let's say, the enemies of Jesus, the opponents of Jesus in this passage, right? The Jews are the bad guys, so to speak, in this passage. It would be easy, and in fact, it has been done over and over and over again throughout history, to take a passage like this one and say, oh, look, see, this is Christianity is right, and the Jews were wrong, right? The Jews are blind. And I mean, I want to make clear that there is a sense. I mean, clearly the Gospel of John wants you to believe in Jesus, right? The Gospel of John is, I mean, that's what it says. That's why John says he wrote the book at the end of the book. He says, I've written so that you may believe. John is trying to convince you to believe in Jesus, and clearly he does think that the quote unquote Jews have gotten some things wrong. But at times in Christian history, this passage and ones like it have been used to fuel a rabid anti-Semitism, right? To say, look how terrible the Jewish people are. Look how terrible it is that they're treating Christians so badly. Look how terrible it is that they're opponents of Jesus, that they oppose Jesus, and again, attributing almost a demonic or devilish quality. And of course, that even if in the context of the historical context of the writing of the Gospel of John, maybe it's the Jews who were expelling the Johannine community. Throughout much of the rest of history, it has been Christians who have treated Jews terribly, right? That, unfortunately, you just have to call it what it is, that a lot of Christian history has been full of really awful anti-Semitism. And sometimes passages like this have been used as a sort of foundation for that kind of anti-Semitism, to say, hey, look, the Jews are Jesus's opponents. So, it's right for Christians to treat them badly or something like that. The irony is that I think in doing that, we actually perpetuate the very sin that this passage is calling out, right? The sin of thinking that we see. So that, yeah, sure, in this passage, it's the quote unquote Jews for whom that's their sin. But surely this has to apply to the church as well, right? That real spiritual blindness is thinking that we see. Spiritual blindness is failing to see acts of God because we are convinced of the infallibility of our own vision. I think that's a great message for the fourth Sunday of Lent. Um, that, yeah, sure, in this story, it's the Jews and the Pharisees who are blind because they fail to see the way that God, the God of Israel, is at work in the person of Jesus. And the reason they fail to see it is because they're convinced of the infallibility of their own vision, right? Let's see, do I have that here? Yeah, here in verse 24, they say, "Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner," right? And of course, we already talked about how they see themselves as Moses' disciples, right? So they're the quote unquote Jews in this story and the Pharisees, they're convinced that they're right. That's the point, right? They're convinced that they are right. They are convinced that they have the correct interpretation of Moses. They are convinced that they know that this man is a sinner. And Jesus is saying that's actually their blindness, right? But if we think that that only applies to the Jews in this passage and that it doesn't apply to us, whoever the us is, right, as Christians reading this gospel or whatever the case is, then we're falling into the same spiritual blindness, right? We're doing the same thing. We are then convinced of the infallibility of our own vision. And I think, at least if I'm preaching or teaching from this passage in the season of Lent, that's what I'm going to emphasize, right? Is that uh, when we are when we lack humility as Christians, when we are so thoroughly convinced of our own positions, then it's we who are blind, right? And that kind of certainty of I know who God is, I know what God is up to in the world. God couldn't possibly do anything that I wouldn't recognize as God's work. That's actually what makes us blind to what God is really doing. And so, in that sense, I think this passage is incredibly challenging, to say the least, and that it is one that can really cut us to the heart, so to speak, in the season of Lent, to ask us to question our own assumptions, because Jesus is saying to us, if you think you see, that's actually where your blind spot probably is. And so I think this passage calls us to consider the ways in which the places in which we are we are so convinced that we are right that we don't even we're not even open to reconsidering those tenets, those beliefs, right? And it is in those places where we won't even consider another option that blindness is most likely to creep in, actually. And I think what the Spirit at least is challenging me to see uh, through this is that to really have sight, to have real spiritual insight, is to have an openness to the new ways in which God might be at work in the world, and that it is that certainty is not a Christian virtue, but humility is among the most Christ-like of the virtues. And I think this passage calls us to confess, to be attentive to and confess our own blindness so that we might have real spiritual insight given through Christ.